won the 1994 Pulitzer Prize for his writing on such topics as crime, AIDS, the Nation of Islam, and violent rap lyrics. His commentary has won Mr. Raspberry a multitude of journalistic awards and more than a dozen honorary degrees. He's the author of a book, Looking Backward at Us. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 101st Landon Lecturer, Mr. William Raspberry.
Good morning, and thank you so much. If I couldn't be off in New York winning the Pulitzer again, I can't think of any place I'd rather be. I've been writing a good deal of late about the violence in our streets, the apathy in our schools, and the hopelessness among our young people. I've been writing about what I have called the crisis in our community. But this morning I want to talk about a deeper, more pervasive, and ultimately more serious crisis. Let me call it our crisis of community. America has a crisis of community that is as deep and wide as it is unnoticed. And it threatens to destroy our solidarity as a nation in much the same way that a similar crisis in community has ripped apart the former Soviet Union and what we used to know as Yugoslavia. I refer, of course, to the gender battles characterized by the Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill holy wars, to the ethnic battles over university canons and multiculturalism, to the political warfare that makes party advantage more important than the success of the nation, and to the racial animosities and suspicions fueled by everything from the rantings of Khalid Abdul Muhammad to the O.J. Simpson trial to Charles Murray's pseudo-intellectual call for racial abandonment. But when I express my fear that we're coming unglued as a society, I'm talking about far more than these things. I'm talking about more even than the normal give and take among the various sectors and ideologies of the society. I'm talking about our growing inability to act, even to think, in the interest of the nation. It's almost as though there is no national interest apart from the aggregate interest of the various components. The whole society seems to be disintegrating into special interest. And not just in politics either. College campuses are being ripped apart by the insistence of one group after another on proving their victimization at the hands of white males and therefore their right to special exemptions and privileges. Let me give you two examples of what I'm talking about. Recently, an elementary school in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, tried an experiment for 1 year, having male teachers teach all boy classes in the primary grades. They started with a group of children who had been deemed educable, mentally retarded. They were problem kids. In 1 year, a third of these boys taught by male teachers in all boy classes made the honor roll. Their behavior improved dramatically. Their discipline, their interest in school, their academic performance, all dramatically improved. That was last year. This year, the arrangement does not exist because somebody decided that all boy classes headed by male teachers constituted discrimination against women and girls, and the program was killed. That's what I'm talking about. That's one example. The other example, quite different. Those of you who fly will remember it when the Federal Aviation Administration adopted the rule that seats in the emergency row, the exit rows on planes, couldn't be occupied by people who were blind, deaf, obese, frail, or otherwise likely to inhibit movement during an emergency situation. Now, the FAA thought it was common sense to have those emergency row seats occupied by people who can hear the instructions of the crew, read the directions for operating the emergency row equipment, and assist other passengers in their escape. But some organizations representing the deaf, blind, and otherwise disabled reacted to the new regulations as a form of discrimination against their group, who they insist have a right to the emergency row seats the same as anybody else. That's what happens when we get too fixated on our group, our own group, to the exclusion of the interest of the whole. I mean, it's true that the majority must never be allowed to run roughshod over the rights of minorities. That's one of the tenets of the American system. But the notion of fairness to the particular group as an element of fairness to the whole has been perverted into a wholesale jockeying for group advantage. Mutual fairness with regard to both rights and responsibilities can be the glue that bonds this polyglot society into a nation. Single-minded pursuit of group advantage threatens to rip us apart at the seams. This struggle for group advantage has us so preoccupied with one another's ethnicity that we're losing our ability to deal with each other as fellow human beings. What are we to make of this dismaying evidence that the relationship among us are getting worse, even among our brightest and best, our college students? Well, I believe two things are happening. The first is the racism and bigotry that never went away, though it was quiet for a time, relatively quiet. The second is what has been called the politics of difference. There's a pattern I've seen repeated on campuses right across America. A black group, perhaps motivated by some combination of discomfort and rejection, goes looking, always successfully by the way, for demonstrable evidence of racism. I used to marvel at the search. I mean, of course there was racism on campus, I'd say, but what was the point of prospecting for it, as though panning for gold? I mean, where was the assay office to which one took these nuggets of racism and traded them in for something of value? It was a naive question on my part, because it turns out there is such an assay office. It's called the administration building. You turn in enough nuggets and you get your reward: a black student union, a special course offering, an African-American wing in a preferred dormitory, whatever. All it takes is proof that you are a victim. But college kids aren't all that stupid, you see. And they were bright enough to see that if there were rewards in the politics of difference, they wanted some too. So the victories won by black students became the models for similar prizes for gay students or Hispanic students or female students, all of whom gather up their nuggets of victimism and take them to the admin building for redemption. Right now, Cornell University, one of the finest institutions in America, has a dormitory called Ujamaa College, a residence for black students, Akwikan, a dorm for Native Americans, and also something called the Latin Living Center. Everybody's victory has resulted in further fragmentation of the campus. That's the trend when the accent is on difference. And finally, it turns out, not here but on other campuses across America, that everybody gets something out of the politics of difference except white males, who start to feel sorry for themselves. And if they can't find anybody to reward them for their sense of being slighted, they may turn to behavior that was once unthinkable, the acting out that manifests itself in incivility, reactionary politics, open bigotry, and on occasion, actual violence. Every gain by minority groups justifies the sense of victimism on the part of white males. And every repugnant act of white males becomes a new nugget for a minority to take to the assay office. Two things get lost in this sad ritual. The first is that the administration seldom gives up any of its own power. The gains of one group of students are extracted from other groups of students, who must then play up their own disadvantage to wrest some small advantage from yet another group. And nothing gets settled, although everybody feels noble and self-righteous in the pursuit. The second overlooked aspect is that the process turns the campus into warring factions, each no doubt imagining itself the moral successor to the heroes of the civil rights movement. There's a difference, though. Dr. King's constantly repeated goal was not special advantage, but unity. His dream was not of a time when blacks would finally overcome whites. His dream was that we should overcome, black and white together, the things that were separating us. His hope was not that we should celebrate our differences, but that we should recognize the relative unimportance of those differences. Now, I know the differences do not seem unimportant. Sometimes we seem to notice only our differences. That's why I find it helpful to look at what used to be Yugoslavia. From this distance, it seems clear that the similarities between the Serbs and the Croats and the other ethnic neighbors in Bosnia-Herzegovina should outweigh their differences. From this distance, we can see that these are people who have long shared the history of a place, of a culture, and indeed many of them were intermarried. But now that Yugoslavia has broken up, even the marriages have been ripped apart. I find myself wishing that these erstwhile Yugoslavs could see for themselves what distance makes clear to us. And I wish we could learn to see ourselves as from a distance. Maybe we'd learn to appreciate how great are our similarities and how trivial our differences, and get our act together. I don't know if there are any Trekkies in the room or not, but there was a Star Trek episode of some years ago that makes precisely the point I want to make this morning. Captain Kirk and his crew in this episode rescue a humanoid who was a remarkable individual, his left side being completely black and his right side completely white. They're in the process of trying to learn the origins of this stranger, Loki, I think they called him, when they are confronted by a similar humanoid, this one black on the right side and white on the left side. The Enterprise crew, of course, can hardly tell them apart. But the humanoids can see themselves not as merely different, but as different as it is possible to be. They are one another's complete opposite. They're totally different in their eyes, and they really don't understand why this isn't obvious to Captain Kirk and the crew. But they're not just opposites. Though they are from the same planet, as it turns out, they are also sworn enemies. I won't try to tell you the whole episode, but let me recall this much. Loki is thought to be a political traitor, and his opposite, Bele, is an official of their home planet's Commission on Political Traitors. And he's been tracing Loki throughout the galaxy for 1,000 years. Loke tries to convince the Enterprise crew that Bele and his kind are murderous oppressors. Bele counters that Loke and his kind are ungrateful savages. The Enterprise crew can't figure it out. They decide to travel near the stranger's planet. But when they come within sensor range, they are astonished to learn that there is no sapient life on that planet. The cities are intact. Vegetation and lower animals abound, but the people are dead. They have annihilated each other. These two have survived only because they happen to be in the business of chasing each other through the galaxy. And what do they do when they learn what has happened to their planet? No, they don't cry and embrace one another. They lunge at each other in final furious battle, each determined to finish the work that his compatriots started. The Enterprise crew, of course, is appalled. But the wise Mr. Spock says, to expect sense from two mentalities of such extreme viewpoints is not logical. They are, he said, playing out the drama of which they have become the captives, just as their compatriots did. But, says Sulu, their people are dead. How can it matter to them now which one was right? It does matter to them, says Spock, and at the same time, in a sense, it doesn't matter. 1,000 years of hating and running have become all of life. We don't learn from this Star Trek episode the nature of the original problem between these warring humanoids, though we can be certain that each felt justified in continuing the war. They had made a mistake that too many of us make in real life. They had forgotten the difference between problems and enemies. And so, my friends, have we. Virtually every issue that strikes us as urgent or important is made more intractable by our insistence on seeing it as a matter of us against them. Give us a problem and we will find an enemy. Remember when the U.S. economy was in such trouble? We simply made the Japanese the enemy. We're concerned about the discouraged and dangerous underclass of the inner cities. Why blame white racists, the enemy? Members of my own profession seem unable to tell a story, no matter how significant that story might be, unless we can transform it into a case of one person or one group against another, unless we can make it a matter of enemies. It's not so much that the enemies we identify are innocent as that identifying and pursuing them through the galaxies of our lives takes time and attention away from the search for solutions. I mean, it was no trouble at all to come up with evidence that the Japanese were hurting the American economy through predatory pricing, product dumping, and non-reciprocity. And certainly all those things needed attention. But the U.S. auto industry improved its position relative to Japan's auto industry, not when we all became expert at bashing our Japanese enemy, but when Detroit started making better cars. When Detroit addressed the problem. And that's the point. The failure to distinguish between the enemy and the problem has us looking balefully at one another instead of jointly attacking the problem, which in most cases is as much a problem for us as for those we attack. Take the current fight over affirmative action, for instance. Politicians who lack the imagination to address the problem settle for giving us each other to attack. White men, particularly those with a high school education or less, are not imagining things when they feel less secure economically than their fathers were. But they make a mistake when they suppose that their jobs have somehow been handed over to black people in the name of affirmative action. Most likely those jobs have not gone to the ghetto, but to Taiwan or Singapore, or have gone up in the smoke of corporate mergers and downsizing. We have got a problem. And we waste our time assaulting enemies. See, honest communication about the problem might lead us to look for ways to restore our industrial base, expand our economy, improve the quality of our products, and put our people to work. Focusing on enemies produces stirring speeches and not much else. You've heard the speeches. You've watched as communities have been ripped apart by those who deliver these speeches. I want you to hear what Teresa Hines, whose husband was the late Pennsylvania senator, I want you to hear how she described some of these speakers and speeches in a recent talk of hers. They are, she said, critical of everything, impossible to please, indifferent to nuance, incapable of compromise. They laud perfection, but oddly never see it in anybody but themselves. They are right all the time, eager to say, "I told you so," and relentlessly unforgiving. They occasionally may mean well, but the effect of even their good intentions is to destroy. They corrode self-confidence and goodwill. They cultivate guilt. They rule by fear and ridicule. They are, she says, creatures of opportunity as much as of principles, extremists of the left and the right who feed on our fear and promote it, who dress up their opponents in ugly costumes, who drive a bitter wedge between us and the other, the one not like us, the one who sees the world just a shade differently. They demonize us by our parts and tear our country into pieces. I don't have Teresa Hines' eloquence, so I say it more simply. They focus on enemies rather than the problem. They forget that at the end of the day, when we've all taken our unfair shots at one another, this simple truth remains: the problem is the problem. Our politicians and factional leaders never miss an opportunity to list the atrocities the enemy has committed against us, but nothing changes. Sometimes we're not even sure what we want to change, or what we want the people we call enemies to do. We say we want things to get better, when sometimes I think we only want to score points. We say we want to live in a society where all of us can come together as brothers and sisters, and the whole time we're saying it, we're busy creating another group of barriers to place between us. It's a strange sort of progress we've made since the death of Dr. King. We have progressed to the point where we are embarrassed to speak of brotherhood, of black and white together, of our shared status as Americans. That, by the way, is not an accusation. It's a confession. All of us are capable of getting so caught up in the distance that remains to be run that we forget to give ourselves full credit for the distance we've come. Yet every now and then we manage to overcome our embarrassment and see things as from a distance. In that spirit, I want to share something I wrote a while back, something I still believe, but something I may have trouble saying again, because it's not easy to say. Here it is. The immigration applications, the legal and illegal dodges for getting into this country, the longings you hear in virtually every part of the world all attest to two astounding facts. The first, widely accepted, though not always with good grace, is that everybody wants to be an American. The second, of which we take almost no notice, is that virtually anybody can become an American. I mean, to see how extraordinary a fact that is, imagine hearing anyone, black, white, or Asian, saying he wants to become Japanese. It sounds like a joke. One can live in Japan, or Ghana, or Sweden, or Mexico, can live there permanently and prosper. But it's essentially impossible to imagine anyone born anywhere else becoming anything else except American. It's a thought that crosses my mind whenever I hear demands that the government protect the ethnic or language heritage of particular groups. When African Americans demand that the public schools adopt an Afrocentric curriculum, for instance, or when immigrants from Latin America are sworn in as American citizens in Spanish. It crossed my mind when I came across Jim Sleeper's essay in defense of civic culture. I won't try to characterize Sleeper's piece or summarize its recommendations. I won't even tell you that I agree with everything he had to say on the subject of race and ethnicity. But he says some things that echo my own feelings, at least some time, and especially when I ponder the extraordinary possibility of becoming American. Sleeper acknowledges the obvious, that the America that counted my great-grandfather as only 3/5 of a human being has never been free of ethnic and racial bigotry, and that bigotry has sometimes achieved the status of law, of philosophy, even of religion. But he notes something else, that America is one of the few places on the globe where the accusation of such bigotry is a serious indictment. You say to the Japanese, for instance, and I don't mean to be picking on the Japanese, but you say to the Japanese that they are prejudiced against Koreans. And I'm talking now about Koreans whose grandfathers were born in Japan, but they are still Koreans, not Japanese. You tell them that they are prejudiced against such people. It's not an accusation, it's a statement of fact, and not particularly an embarrassing fact. To accuse Americans of bigotry is a serious charge, even when America has been at its ugliest in fact. Slavery, the slaughter of Native Americans, the internment of the Japanese during the Second World War, and the full range of private and public atrocities. Yet, I'm quoting Sleeper now, yet always has America held out the promise that, as Ralph Waldo Emerson put it, in this asylum of all nations, the energy of all the European tribes and of the Africans and of the Polynesians will construct a new race. This civic culture that Sleeper writes about includes the notion of Americans as a different race, a new and different race. It's the new world. But it also entails what he describes as characteristic American virtues: tolerance, optimism, self-restraint, self-reliance, reason, public-mindedness. Virtues that he says are taught and caught in the daily life of local institutions and in the example set by neighbors, co-workers, and public leaders. It is, he suggests, the internalizing of these virtues that defines becoming American. But here's the thing, the transformation works both ways. If people from an awesome range of colors, cultures, and ethnicities have become Americans, so has America become what it is and what it continues to become by absorbing and embracing these myriad influences. Some of us are angry, and ought to be, that our academic texts and teachings still disregard or underestimate our part of these influences. Some of us are disappointed that what we bring to the smorgasbord is often undervalued, even brutally rejected. But surely the cure is in working for greater inclusion, not for working for cultural isolation. That's what observers as different as Sleeper, as Arthur Schlesinger, and John Gardner have been saying. That's what Gary Trudeau was saying a couple years ago in that hilarious and sobering series of Doonesbury strips that ended with black students at a local university already having attained their separate courses and dormitories, demanding at last separate drinking fountains. Sleeper's insight is that there is nothing natural or automatic about those values and attitudes that used to be called the American way. Educators must teach them, he says, and also teach that self-esteem is enhanced not simply through pride in one's cultural origins, but more importantly, by taking pride in one's mastery of civic virtues and graces that all Americans share and admire in building our society. Now, critics of this view will argue that Sleeper's virtuous and graceful American is a figment, that America is a deeply, perhaps irredeemably racist society. I, in my more optimistic moments, prefer to think that Americans are still becoming Americans, just as America is still becoming America. How can we accelerate that becoming? By recognizing its importance to start with, by understanding that hating and running must not be all of life, and by working to grasp the difference between problems and enemies. You see, confront a difficulty as a problem, and you've already taken the first steps toward creating the climate for change. Confront it as the work of enemies, and you create the necessity of defeating somebody, of intimidating somebody, of browbeating someone into doing something against his will. Enemies have to be sought out, branded, and punished, which naturally gives them one more reason to find an opportunity to strike back at us, and the beat goes on. Problems, on the other hand, admit of cooperative solutions that can build community. Searching for enemies is most often a pessimist game, calculated less to resolve difficulties than to establish that the difficulties are somebody else's fault. Identifying problems, on the other hand, is by its very nature optimistic and healing. The whole point of delineating problems is to fashion solutions. I think maybe that's what President Clinton had in mind when he called on America, and this was back before he became President Clinton, called on America to bring back the old spirit of partnership, of optimism, of renewed dedication to common efforts. We need, he said, an array of devoted, visionary, healing leaders throughout this nation, willing to work in their communities to end the long years of denial and neglect and divisiveness and blame, to give the American people their country back. And that is precisely what we need. America has had enough of the politics of difference, the marketing of disadvantage, the search for enemies. It's about time we started to work on what may be the most important problem we face: how to heal our crisis of community and make America work. not for blacks or whites or women or gays, not for ethnics, not for Christians, Muslims, or Jews, but for Americans. Thank you very much.
We'll take a few questions.
Sure.
Excellent. Excellent. Very timely. Very well delivered. Thank you very much, Mr. Raspberry, for that excellent Landon lecture. Now we have an opportunity for some questions, and we have microphones on your right or left. So if you would like to ask any questions, just please proceed to the microphone. I think we have one over here.
Yes. As a faculty advisor to one of the fraternities here at K-State, it's not a question, but you can comment if you will. I'm very, very surprised that this fraternity, which I had pledged 30 years ago, still today does not seek black students or Hispanic students. And it is totally the opposite of what I saw happening in 1961, 62, and 63.
Yeah, I think what you've said is a reflection of the things that I've tried to talk about and that I find worrisome. In the particular cases, it's easy enough to explain why even black fraternities and sororities remain black fraternities and sororities, although an increasing number of them have rushed white students and have taken in white members. I know the comfort of withdrawing into your own little group of people who are like you. Some of them get to be dating societies. All kinds of things go on. I think it's well to ask ourselves a second and third time when we find ourselves withdrawing into our own little cliques. Does this forward anything that we deeply believe in? Or does it run counter to the principles we espouse? I don't say that always will give you the answer as to whether to join a fraternity or sorority or not join it. But it's a question that is well to keep in mind, and I keep it in mind even when I'm off to do business with the National Association of what? Black Journalists. We do withdraw, but I think it's well to make sure that we do it for purposes that we would be proud to state. Thank you.
I don't see any other questions out there.
I've got two more answers.
It seems to me, Mr. Raspberry, that you are citing a problem that I might define as the abandonment of common sense. Do you have a solution, let's say, that we might start implementing at the local level?
I didn't hear the last part.
I'm asking, do you have suggestions for how we might attack that problem, which I've paraphrased as the abandonment of common sense? How do we approach that at the local level?
I'll tell you my own approach to it. Is this, because you see, there are enemies out there sometimes, you see, who wish us harm and will do us harm. So we can't ignore that part. My own test is this: if I manage to defeat the enemy I have designated, will my problem be near a solution? If the answer is no, then I'm probably well advised to focus on the problem and forget the enemy. The difficulty is that we haven't, I think we've lost in recent years the ability to make the separation. We adore having enemies because it makes us feel self-righteous. You don't have to figure out anything. All you have to do is say, there he is. There's a thing I used to do with some of my friends. I must do it again soon. I used to go scouring through old speeches and stuff by other important people. And I would tell them, look, I've got a series of quotes here from the speeches of Clarence Thomas, Jesse Jackson, and Martin Luther King. And maybe I'd throw in Tom Sowell. And I'm going to read you the quote, and you tell me whether you agree or disagree with the sentiment. It is utterly astounding. You cannot get anybody to answer the question unless they first try to figure out who said it. They are afraid to death that they will wind up saying, that makes sense to me, only to learn that it was Clarence Thomas who said it. That's the enemy.
I think that's it. Thank you very much for coming this morning. Good luck. Thank you.